joining us in India. We're really delighted to have with us a foremost expert on employment law join us from Khaitan and Company to talk about the managing your workforce and all of the labor and employment issues that are going to come up during the pandemic. Let me first talk to you a little bit about the title and why I came up with the title, and then also I'd like to tell you a little bit about what USIBC and the Chamber is doing to address some of the issues. Some of you may be familiar with the title, The Hammer and the Dance. It actually came from an article that aired a few weeks ago from a pandemic expert here in the US that's been widely cited, though not registered or copyrighted yet, the title. But basically what he says is as we start to figure out how the virus is being spread, we will start to loosen restrictions a little bit. And then if we see that infection rates go up, we will have to close everything down again. And so over the next, who knows how long, but probably a year or so or longer, his thesis is that we will loosen and tighten and loosen and tighten. And the tighten is the hammer. You kind of close everything down and, all of us stay home. And the dance is the slow loosening of certain restrictions. And this is particularly important as we look to how we're going to handle that in our workplaces. The Chamber, for example, has formed 4 task force to look at how we would propose to open up and manage health in different environments. And that's particularly important because it's going to depend on whether your organization is a manufacturing intensive workforce, or if it is a customer facing workforce like Starbucks, or if it's an office environment where maybe people are closer together. And each of those different scenarios is going to have a different strategy to open, and different issues that we're going to have to deal with, both from a legal perspective as well as a policy perspective on opening. So first, I just want to let you know that we have formed those 4 task force groups and would be happy to send anyone more information on participating in those to provide your input about what you and your organization are thinking about and what you're planning for as we start to slowly open back up. As well as some of the liability and other issues that come with the opening. So as I mentioned, I'm really excited that we have with us Anshul Prakash, who's a partner at Khaitan and Company, one of India's largest law firms. And Anshul is a partner in the Corporate and Commercial Practice Group in Mumbai. He specializes in employment and labor laws and heads the firm's employment, labor, and benefit laws practice. He's advised various prominent domestic and international clients on issues related to employment in respect to labor law compliance, labor audit, transfer and relocation of employees, and all sorts of other issues relevant to what our organizations are going through now dealing with the pandemic. So I'm delighted to have Anshul with us here today. I'm going to ask Anshul to go ahead and unmute himself. I've muted everyone else. There is the option to ask questions if you're on the video chat through your chat box. So go ahead and hit the chat icon and type in your question anytime during the presentation. If you would like to ask a question, and we will get to them towards the end of the presentation. We also will save a little bit of time at the very end if you choose to unmute yourself to ask it through the video chat. It's always good to see faces as well, as we all are up in our homes and quarantined. Or if you want to, if you're on the phone line and you want to join us, just hit *6 to unmute yourself. But for right now, we're going to keep you all muted, and we're going to turn it over to Anshul to share with us some of the issues that we all need to be thinking about in this environment. So Anshul, I'll turn it over to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you all for joining in. For those on the state side, very good morning or good day. For those joining in from India, very good evening, or I would say late in the night it is. Thank you all for joining in. And in terms of agenda, so I will just very quickly cover all the aspects pertaining to the current COVID-19 backdrop, the lockdown directives which have been issued by the Government of India and appropriate state governments, the issue pertaining to various issues which have been really coming up in the COVID-19 times. The most crucial aspect is about the workforce and the disruption it has really caused, and what exactly could be considered to be a new normal is something we are going to discuss. The third aspect is going to be in respect of continuity planning, because 3rd of May is not exactly the benchmark date one would consider in these unprecedented times. So one has to continue ensuring that you are planning, you are really mindful of the lockdown implications as we proceed towards gradual opening of various sectors in the country. Uh, on the fourth one, we are going to look at various government directives, the legal considerations around it, especially pertaining to payment of wages, redundancies, exit of employees, outsourced workforce, casual workforce, etc. And of course, the last couple of points in relation to various aspects which could be related to resuming operations, the standard operating procedures, and of course, the cost it would entail, uh, given the current times and the directives which are in force. So if you move on to the next slide, very quickly on the aspect of how exactly are we looking at the current situation in India. And as of 30th April, 8 a.m., we have around 23,651 active cases, 1,074 fatalities, and 8,324 persons who have been discharged. Of course, Maharashtra, which is the industrial hub, is the most impacted one. And we are looking at a 5th state week of lockdown 2.0. We are still looking at borders which continue to remain sealed. In fact, of late, the Ministry of Home Affairs has indeed taken some step in the direction of allowing states to have workers commute from one state to another state to join work once the industries resume operations as per the guidelines. There is scattered relaxation in terms of how the services can be rendered, how businesses can open up. Supply chain per se, unless and until we are absolutely talking about essential services, that is groceries, we are talking about essential services pertaining to medical and healthcare facilities, uh, sanitation facilities, but all the rest is in terms of absolute disruption right now. Transportation continues to remain an issue. And of course, as I mentioned in the beginning, 3rd of May is not just the benchmark. We are looking at possibility of lockdown 3.0. It may be the case and situation remains fluid. We will not be mistaken to draw an inference that various states, irrespective of how the union government is going to really lift up the lockdown across the country, the states may continue to have lockdown on a more extended basis. So we are looking at some relaxations which could be promised. But of course, when it comes to metropolitan cities like Mumbai, Bangalore, even Gurugram, Delhi, it does continue to remain gloomy. It is still slow. So we are looking at a couple of other aspects directly pertaining to management of workforce. At the next slide, please. So a couple of questions which have arisen from across the industry, especially with clients based out of the states, about their subsidiaries, whether they will be able to have any benefit in terms of scheme which could be familiar to that of other Western jurisdictions. And the response to that would be that relief to employers, the industry, in terms of incentivizing them to continue to pay wages to the employees, even during the lockdown situation, irrespective of the work not being done, even remotely. The relief is far and few. So only with respect to social security contributions have we seen some relief which has been accorded by the central government. It is primarily in relation to medium small scale enterprises who have employees up to 100, and even those employees could be earning to the tune of Indian national rupees 15,000 per month. That is 90% strength. And in that case, it could be where the social security organization in this country could subsidize and completely bear the cost of provident fund contribution for your workforce. But nothing which is in terms of a concrete measure which could be called as a relief to the industry at large. Uh, Assistance to workforce in terms of marginalized sections. So we are talking about construction workers, we are talking about people who are engaged in unorganized sector. So there are some instances where the government has indeed announced some relief packages, but not for the organized sector per se. Uh, Statutory compliance relaxations have been given in terms of filing of returns in relation to maintenance of registers and how you really need to uh, approach the authorities and ensure compliance within a particular lockdown period. So it has been extended. We are talking about a timeline which could be extended to at least June. Currently, it's a 3-month extension which has been given. So that is something we are contemplating, that probably not just from a social security and state insurance standpoint, we could be looking at more extensions of timeline which could be regularly applicable to industries, whether on the manufacturing or the services side. Next slide, please. So of course, at least until 3rd of May, India continues to be under lockdown. As I mentioned earlier also, we are contemplating, we are foreseeing situations where there could be containment zones, which are called red zones or hotspots, especially in the metropolitan regions, including the greater Mumbai area, where we would see that there is an absolute restriction in terms of industries and uh, commercial establishments having to be able to operate even on a reduced headcount basis. So we have to see how the situation is going to evolve. But I have to really remind you that situation on paper and situation in reality might be a bit different. Even if you have certain relaxations which may have been accorded to you as an organization in terms of reduced headcount, for example, for IT establishments which are falling in the exempted category, even when it comes to essential services or essential commodities which are related to e-commerce activities, it is done in a very phase-wise manner. It is done on an absolute reduced headcount basis. So, for example, IT establishments are allowed to have up to 50% of the headcount being present in their offices, provided they are not falling in a containment area. And when I say containment area, it is essentially as per the Union Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, where there is a large outbreak or there is an outbreak in clusters where in fact the quarantine measures are currently in place. So even ITS services have been restricted. Effectively, in practice, what is happening is that you have to really approach the online e-passes facility for your employees to commute in these lockdown situations. And even once the lockdown is lifted, and we are yet to see whether it is going to go beyond 3rd of May, but in practice, very less permission is being granted for organizations, especially near or around the containment areas. The government continues to be, and the local authorities continue to be wary of people not being acting in a more disciplined fashion when it comes to commuting and maintaining social distancing. Work from home has become the new norm, and probably it could be the time for all the organizations to really look at work from home as one of the key concepts which may apply to them from a future perspective. So policies which earlier had work from home as an exception now have to be looked upon as more of a normal. And there comes a point where you have to determine data privacy issues, you are determining performance related aspects, you are looking at issues pertaining to how the employees can be made more aware of their continuing obligations when they're using social media, when they're using company provided devices. Of course, there are practical issues which continue to exist. There are certain functions, there are certain industries, especially on the manufacturing side, who cannot have all the employees working from home. So there are some questions which have indeed arisen from the perspective of how really you need to reduce work hours, whether the question could be about reduced wages. How do you really need to have a policy consideration around it? Uh, of course, monitoring policy compliance at all times. The question would be, if at all you're looking at performance as a new kind of position for the employees who are working or operating remotely, you need to have appropriate mechanisms where they could reach out to the workforce, reach out to their peers, reach out to their HR departments, if there is any helpline for the difficulties they could be facing. Uh, Sensitivity, empathy could be the key here when it comes to managing the workforce, which is reporting on work remotely. There are certain industries which are having continued production, which may fall in the essential services category. But even in those cases, we are looking at a minimal number of staff which could be deployed. So please be mindful of the fact that don't just rely on the media news, don't just rely on the headlines which are there. WhatsApp is something which is making quite a few things viral these days, but things are quite grave. There are serious issues around how you need to comply with workforce considerations in terms of deployment, how you need to comply with the minimum pass requirements which could be issued by the competent authority from a local district administration standpoint. There are extensive SOPs, standard operating procedures, and compliances which have been recently as of 15th April, and it continues to be fluid. More guidelines are coming in terms of amendments and additions, which do talk about even post 3rd of May, requirements for industries, whether it is on the manufacturing side or we are talking about services sector, to comply with those requirements if at all you want to continue with your operations in terms of resumption. But of course, containment zones, it is absolutely prohibited. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, work from home policy, you need to revisit what you really have been looking at in terms of employee conduct, whether we are talking about asking the employee to fill a form when he logs in, when he logs out. How do you really track overtime or complete number of hours being spent? Is it on the basis of a particular project? What about those employees who are not assigned to a specific project but are catering to support functions? How do you really determine their performance, their productivity? Privacy would be the key. Of late, we have been involved in various exercises where we have held virtual meetings for the employees who are currently allowed to work from home and they are remotely operating, to remind them of their obligation in terms of continuous confidentiality to be maintained for any information which is coming to their knowledge. Uh, uh, at least ensuring the very perspective of managing social media interface when it comes to employees, because it is very common for employees who are sitting at home to also engage with external parties. Continuing interaction is something which is very, very common these days. So we need to ensure how to separate employees from common discussions which are outside the workplace and not to mingle that with something which can be considered to be sensitive from business standpoint. Of course, cost in terms of work from home, IT infrastructure, softwares which could be deployed. There have been sensitivities around utilization of certain software for holding virtual meetings. So those also would be the issues for the future. Even at present, employers are looking at various issues pertaining to how to really up the gradation in terms of their technical competencies. Are we really looking at upgrading the infrastructure, even if we are going to have a long-term approach when we are allowing the employees to work from home? Of course, we are looking at other aspects when it comes to temporary shutdown of operations. We are looking at tracking their productivity. We are also looking at the overall perspective of any practical issues which may arise for employees who may be considered to be mission critical, who may be tagged and allowed to commute to workplace during temporary shutdown or partial lockdown situations. There are essential functions like security. There could be essential functions like server maintenance. How do you really deal with that? Specifically, if you are working out from a commercial building where it is a multi-storied complex, is it really necessary only for you to have a permit or a pass from the competent authority, or you also need to approach the building management to do so? From a practical perspective, it has been our experience that the building management also needs to be taken into confidence if we are going to resume our operations. Passes have to be endorsed by either the local police station or the local police superintendent or commissioner's office, unless and until it has been announced that e-permit facilities are also allowed in that particular state, which is very commonly the case these days. But that is being allotted and allowed on a very limited basis. So be mindful of identifying your critical employees who will be in the first phase of resumption of operations, be very essential for your business to normalize. Please do be mindful of the fact that if you are putting in your efforts from the perspective of any ongoing collective bargaining agreement negotiations, any charter of demands, specifically for those who are falling in the manufacturing sector, this could be an issue where you need to be mindful of sensitivities on ground. There could be a certain exercise when it comes to performance appraisals, which may have already happened. And the question which usually arises is, can we ask the people to go because they have not performed? And the perspective here would be that there are emotions which are running high. There are labor authorities who are acting in a certain overzealous manner. So important point would be to understand that whether we have adequate paper trail to demonstrate that there are indeed performance issues for these employees to have been asked to move out, or are we talking about COVID-19 being the reason or financial difficulties being the reason to have them exited from the company? Uh, SOPs are very important, standard operating procedures, and very quickly to really touch base on what exactly are we looking at when it comes to the current lockdown situation where you could have been allowed to temporarily operate, or even post lockdown, what you are supposed to do in terms of managerial responsibility. Just to clarify, even when you resume operations tomorrow and in a God forbidden case, there is an issue of a symptomatic employee at your workplace, it is not going to be a strict criminal liability which could be imposed on the managerial personnel. The Union Home Ministry has already clarified its position. Of course, the endeavor has to be to follow the standard operating procedures to the T. But if you are having any employee who has been diagnosed with COVID-19 in these situations, it will not be the case that you will be prosecuted being an occupier of the factory or somebody who could be deemed as in charge of a service sector establishment. A couple of points in relation to the workplace management when it comes to the standard operating procedures. Of course, we are looking at providing some private transport facility which could operate at 30 to 40% capacity. We are going to have some issues pertaining to e-passes for our workers who could be allowed to use private vehicles. Sanitization and hygiene would be the key in the next few days. You need to really continue to have disinfectants and sanitation processes clearly carved out. You need to have face masks, sanitizers being provided to the workers on a compulsory basis. Looking at from the perspective of running or operating cafeterias, one must avoid to the extent possible, very close-knit group of people sitting or operating together in terms of having lunches or even on the shop floor. A minimum 6 feet distancing, unless and until we have cogent reasons or reasonable cause to ask for an exemption or exception to that norm. This is something which is very important for employers across sectors, across industries to follow. And of course, crash courses for your employees. And one would also encourage recording of those trainings, which is being imparted to the employees, whether they are on shop floor or even before the resumption of operations. When making any application for any kind of exemption to the standard operating procedure which has been prescribed, be mindful of providing all necessary proofs as to what you have done in the form of a handbook or a blue book in terms of how you propose to implement standard operating procedures on your premises. Next slide, please. So in terms of government support being there, as I just mentioned, local administration, the deputy commissioners, the local police authorities, they continue to act in a more overzealous fashion, primarily because the first objective of the government is to contain the pandemic, contain the outbreak. It is not really the case that everyone is looking towards resumption of businesses as soon as possible. Everybody is going to treat SOPs in a very strict manner. There have been instances where, at least in the northern part of the country, where district administration has been making some inspections on the premises, and if found that the management has not taken necessary steps, It is not just the case where employee has been found symptomatic. It is also the situation where SOPs have not been found to be complied with. The authorities have sealed or put those premises under lockdown, and then it becomes the case for you as the management to go on and rectify any of those shortcomings. So be mindful of what we exactly are doing. SOPs are not something which are just in the nature of guidelines. These have been issued from the perspective of Disaster Management Act, which gives the government sweeping powers to even prosecute individuals who are not following the standard operating procedures to the best of their abilities. Of course, engage with the unions, do have a business continuity accord protocols, work with the authorities on ground also as to what you exactly propose to do. When you have to implement the SOPs, don't work in isolation. It will be important to demonstrate very clearly on what you propose to do as opposed to something which is being done by way of protocols internally. You also need to look at the extended timeline. We are looking at not just 3rd May as the benchmark, but even 3 or 4 months or 6 months down the line. How are you going to really manage costs? Are you looking at mitigating operating losses? Are we looking at headcount reductions as a possibility? The question would be whether it is doable. The response will be when it comes to your non-managerial workforce, try to be acting on a more sensitive basis. Try to ensure that the workers are not deprived of what is due to them, even if you are planning a retrenchment exercise. Be mindful of the fact that the moment lockdown is lifted and you're working on a reduced headcount basis, the industrial relations laws of this country will continue to apply to you. So you have to follow the law. You have to ensure that even if there is a proposed headcount reduction, if you have trade unions, sensitivities which are there on grounds, be mindful of engaging with them unless and until there are absolute cogent reasons for you to do away with the services of employees. For managerial personnel, there could be issues pertaining to taking those employees into confidence. Communication will be the key. You need to reach out to your people. What authorities are right now frowning upon is arbitrary and unilateral action on part of organizations who are talking about no work, no pay principle, even during the lockdown situation. Next slide, please. So one of the key questions which have arisen of late and in fact during the entire lockdown situation is that government, both central government and state governments have been issuing certain advisories and orders which are compelling the private sector establishments to continue to pay wages even when there is no work which is being performed even remotely. So how to really manage that kind of a situation? Is it binding on us? Are we going to be prosecuted? Is it a civil issue or a criminal issue? The view which we have been taking is that although there has been a Union Home Ministry order in terms of migrant workers, but also goes on to say that employers are required to continue to pay wages at the work location of the employees. The view would be that first of all, this particular order pertains to migrant workers, and those migrant workers are engaged through third-party contractors who are allowed to work in another state while their hometown or home location is in another state. And the question arose before the Union Home Ministry because of an unprecedented movement of these migrant workers from their current work location to their hometown, which is in another state. And then the Union Home Secretary asked the state bureaucracy of various states to ensure that adequate shelter and measures are taken for the migrant workers to stop their movement, and social distancing measures could be really realized and objective maintained at all times. But then it went out to the issue of whether you as a private sector employer is required to continue to pay wages. Can you adjust leaves against the number of days which have not been worked by an employee? The answer would be you cannot do that unilaterally. You can, by way of policy change in a prospective manner, ask the employees to reduce the carry forward of leaves while maintaining the statutory cap. Uh, Otherwise, it could be a consensual arrangement where you can agree with the employees in the unprecedented times to have adjustment of leaves. You also need to be mindful of your own standing orders, which are certified, or whether you are following the model standing orders under the applicable law in the country, in terms of any mandatory provisions which may apply to you as an industrial establishment, especially as a factory, to ask compulsorily the workers to be allowed to avail the leaves which currently stand to their credit. And then we are talking about a situation where it could be a reduced wage payment by virtue of adequate notice being given to them. Try to avoid retrospective reduction in wages. This is something which has been creating issues. So if it is a wage reduction which is planned for the month of May, try to ensure that you notify your non-managerial personnel in advance. Minimum duration is 21 days in majority of the states. So please do that. Other than that, if the question arises whether I can hold back on variable payments, whether I can hold back on my productivity linked incentives, the answer would be yes, you could do that. Unless and until any of these payments are in the nature of ordinarily payable amounts which could be paid to the employees or workers on a monthly basis. So in terms of managing workforce expenses, as I just mentioned on the non-essential payouts, for managerial employees, there is no issue at all. For your workforce, especially if you have any collective bargaining agreement which has already been executed, please be mindful of the sensitivities involved and approach cautiously those issues instead of unilaterally acting simply because there are financial activities which are being faced. From a no work from home perspective, the principle of no work, no pay may not entirely be relevant in the current circumstances because the courts have taken a very clear approach in this regard that unless and until there are reasons which could be attributable to the employee per se, where he fails to report to work, if he is unable to report to work because of the current circumstances, we are looking at a situation of no work, some pay instead of no work, no pay at all. So that is something you need to be mindful of, especially when you're dealing with the non-managerial personnel, your desk job executives, your people on the shop floor, whether you are talking about a services sector establishment or a manufacturing sector establishment. Of course, it could be a case where employee fails to report to work when he's falling in the essential services category, which are clearly demarcated by the competent governments across the states or at the central level. You may, as an employer, treat that particular day or duration as leave without pay. But be mindful of the fact that if there is any logistical issue where the e-pass has already expired or e-permit has expired, if there are issues pertaining to the employee already residing in a containment zone where he is not allowed to move out because of the restrictions which are currently in place. So those kind of scenarios could be kept in mind when you immediately take a step on a disciplinary ground against an employee. Disciplinary actions, actions amounting to misconduct, you may definitely act. There is no embargo on terminations on those grounds, provided you follow the due process. There have been charges which have been looked at. The employee has been found to be guilty in terms of an internal inquiry to have been for you to be able to take immediate action based on those recommendations from the inquiry officer. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the situation remains fluid and we have to really change the business outlook, not just in terms of how we are really going to have mitigating instances of operating losses. Are we looking at certain changed approach when it comes to workforce management? We are looking at human capital, whether we are looking at more from a humanitarian standpoint, or are we really talking only from a financial perspective? One of the key aspects would be to devise ways of looking at rationalizing your non-core activities. Are we really dealing with outsourced employees? If there is a ramp down of operation which has been asked by or ordered by your clients and you are completely based on your client or customer orders, then in that case, whether you're talking about redeployment of your workforce as an option, are you looking at reskilling of your employees to ensure that once you resume operations and to the extent the normalcy is retained in the near future, are we looking at different kind of aspects which could be really adopted instead of looking at only one perspective when we manage the workforce, whether on the shop floor or on your workplace premises? You need to track the incentives. You need to track how these incentives have been previously doled out to the employees. It is not a normal scenario for you to announce promotions increments from time to time. Whatever has been customary, you need to really probably break from that customs or traditions to tell the employees very clearly where you stand as an employer, so that any expectations which are not being met is not being seen as something which is suddenly coming out of the blue for the employees. So continuous engagement with the employees would be very important. It is not just from the legal perspective on what you're supposed to do, but also from a pure human resources management standpoint, we have to be very clear in our approach in this regard. Uh, Emergency isolation rooms is something which is very commonly being seen as a step when it comes to employers who are proposing to come back to work. Whether it is going to be a mandatory case for you to report to the authorities about any symptomatic employee, the answer would be yes. In certain cases, state governments in Maharashtra, in Haryana, and some other northern states have made it mandatory for the employers, whether it is a factory or it is a case of a commercial establishment or an IT establishment, to report any symptomatic employee immediately to the nearest quarantine health facility. Do ensure that the concerned employee is isolated until the health authorities are approaching or arriving at that particular facility. Emergency planning will be very important. Please have an internal guidance note created, not just interacting with the external agencies, not just interacting or retaining people who are going to take forward steps for sanitation, etc., but also the responsibility which could be fixed on resources internally, so that there are clear protocols which are established for you as the management, and ensuring that there is interface clearly established between the external agencies, law enforcement bodies, and you as the management vis-a-vis the employees. For example, if there is any symptomatic employee which is there, you are going to establish or demonstrate that there have been indeed been action on your part to ensure that preventive measures have been taken and isolation facilities to the extent possible have been provided for. Uh, yes, prohibitory cost in terms of complying with the standard operating procedures will be a deterrent. We are looking at increased expenses on fumigation or sanitation, but what we are really looking at right now is a gradual resumption of operations. It will not be the case, at least for the next couple of months, to have all the employees reporting on the shop floor, on the workplaces for commercial establishments or the industries, because social distancing as a measure is clearly set out as in terms of guidelines by the Union Home Ministry and state ministries across the country. So these are a couple of points which we had to make in the current unprecedented times. And one of the questions which I just very quickly wanted to cover in terms of outsourced workforce. So if you are having contract workers who have been engaged through third-party agencies, please do rely on the contractual stipulation about any minimum guaranteed payments, even during suspended operations. You as a principal employer are not liable to pay wages to the contract workers for any period of non-deployment, but be ensured that in terms of any sensitivities from a local law standpoint, try to engage with the contractors, and if there is any humane approach which is going to be adopted during the lockdown period, one could talk about payment of minimum wages instead of the gross wages which are ordinarily paid to employees as if they have been deployed on the premises. So I think with that, I end the presentation, and happy to take any questions on any of the slides, any of the issues which have been dealt with.
Thanks very much, Anshul. Thank you for that really detailed and comprehensive presentation, which I think covered a lot of different areas, kind of where we are today, as well as where we could be as things open back up. And I especially appreciate the information on protecting the organization, because I think as we start to come back into the new normal, a lot of our members and companies are going to want to see, not just, how we do it, but what are the protective measures that we need to be putting in place. All right, we have a few minutes left. There is a chat box in your console, as I mentioned. If you want to ask a question, you can go ahead and type it into the chat box. You can also unmute yourself, and if you would like to have us see you, you can turn your camera on and ask your question that way, or if you've joined through the computer. And if you have joined through the phone line, you can hit *6 to unmute yourself. So let me just pause for a few seconds and see if anyone has questions here. Otherwise, I have a few that have come in from us as well.
Sure, Ami, I can see one question which is there in the chat box. And I think I've covered that point, but nevertheless, I'm going to repeat it that if there is the operations are resumed and the employee is found positive as an occupier, what is the risk? As I mentioned, the Union Home Secretary has very recently clarified the position of Home Ministry and, of course, issued directives to the state chief secretaries to ensure that local administrations across the country do not misinterpret the provision of standard operating procedures being followed. And if at all there is any symptomatic employee on the shop floor or commercial premises, there is no strict criminal liability which is going to be immediately imposed on the occupier unless and until we are looking at a situation where the standard operating procedures may not have been followed. And in case there are any exceptions, those exceptions have not been pointed out to the local administration. So the idea would be not to wait for the authorities to come in. One of the measures which we have taken for some of our clients is to proactively engage with the authorities, inviting them to have inspections on the premises to ensure that if there are any points which could be really raised by the authorities even when you resume operations, that is something which could be really ring-fenced for you as an occupier of the factory. So that is something I can cover from that standpoint.
Great. Other questions, either on the video chat or on the phone? Otherwise, I'll turn to one other question that came through.
Yeah, I think there is one more question which has come in terms of statutory bonus during this phase. To very quickly cover that point, bonus is not a variable incentive which is payable to an employee. It is not really linked to company's performance as such, because whether you have profits or whether you don't have profits, the law is very clear. You have to pay certain minimum bonus, which is right now at 8.33%. So at least for the past financial year, you have to pay bonus as per the accounting exercise which you may have done in terms of having any allocable surplus. But yes, as you go down the line for the current year, you may have to look at the perspective of whether you have any surplus which is currently in the company's coffers, or you are required to pay minimum bonus to the employee, which is a very, I would say, minuscule amount in comparison to how you really look at the gross wages which are going to be paid to the employees. So that is something you cannot completely do away with. Bonus is an integral constituent. Minimum bonus will be payable to the employees who are eligible and covered under the law, irrespective of you under lockdown or not having profits for a particular year.
Mr. Prakash, I have one question. Can you hear me? Sundar Advani is my name. Our hotel in Goa had no occupancy in April. No one could come to work because of lockdown. We've asked the employees to adjust their privileged leave in lieu of salary for April. The outside union claims employees need to be paid in full. Is there a statute which reads no work, no pay?
Right. So I think I'll quickly cover that point, which was covered in one of the slides, Mr. Armani. And no work, no pay as a principle is only applicable under Indian law, which says that if the employee or the worker is unable to report to work for reasons attributed to him or her, and the current lockdown is such that it cannot be really blamed on the employee for his failure to do that. Especially if you are talking about you being a manufacturing establishment, one way is about temporary suspension of service or layoff, which could have been announced during the lockdown period, where you as an employer are unable to assign any work to your shop floor employees or workmen. So that is one way of looking at it, but no work, no pay as a principle or compulsory adjustment of leaves, unless and until permissible under your standing orders, is not something which is provided for under the law. So you need to arrive at a consensus, agree with your employees, and have an implied or express consent from them for leave adjustments for that period.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Other questions? *6 on your phone, or you can unmute your microphone on the video screen. Anshul, let me ask one question that came through on email, and that is about transportation. So obviously organizations can protect and create structures around keeping their employees safer in the resumption to work phase at the office or at the manufacturing site by various different protocols. But one thing that's a little harder for them to control is actually getting their employees to the site, particularly where they rely on public transportation. I wanted to see if you had any advice for our organizations on that. I know some companies are offering like private transportation services, but do you have any advice or recommendations that you're giving companies in terms of getting their employees to the work site?
Good question, Amy. And the situation, as I mentioned, continues to remain fluid. I'm not expecting public transport services to resume anytime soon, because I think the moment it is resumed, you will have people running onto the stations or using private cab services on their own, and it is quite imminent that people may not be following the standard operating procedures while plying the vehicles. So that is the reason, because you have to contain the pandemic. We are looking at the possibility of majority of the employers having to have employees either work from home, and I'm talking about especially services sector establishments, or resuming operations on a reduced headcount basis, where they engage private sector, private transport agencies to ply their employees from their work location to home, and vice versa. So that is right now the only perspective which I'm looking at in terms of how you can encourage the employees to report to work. But there is nothing which has been really provided for as an incentive by the appropriate state governments to allow the people to have their employees commute, whether through personal means or through company means.
Right. Okay. Thank you. We have a few questions that have come through on the chat box. You might take a look there, or I can read them for you if you want.
I'm just looking at these questions. So it does say, is it mandatory for private establishments to follow the advisory being issued by the state and central government, especially with respect to payment of salary and layoff? So I very quickly, before I respond to this question, don't treat layoff and termination from services in the same bracket. Layoff is under Indian law a temporary suspension of services, and layoff as a concept only applies to industrial establishments which are falling in the category of a factory which employs 50 or more workers at any point in time. So I think the question is pertaining to terminations and full payment of salaries during the lockdown period. And as I mentioned to you, that no work, no pay as a principle should not be adopted in this case. We are looking at reduced operations. We are looking at employees who are unable to report to work. So there has been a view which has been taken by several industry associations that we need to comply in totality with the state directives or central government directives. The response will be that try to avoid arbitrary measures. There have been instances where suddenly the employees get to know that in their bank account, when they're expecting the very day when the account is going to be credited with the salary, they find reduced salaries or wages. So in that case, and especially if you have a trade union which is operating on the premises, there are more sensitivities involved. Labor authorities could come in and raise issues. And this is not just from a COVID-19 standpoint, even beyond it. So that is something which has to be dealt with sensitivity, but no immediate criminal prosecution, which can be ordered against you if you follow the process of notifying the employees in advance for any reduced wages. So that is kind of an answer. And of course, the matter is before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has indeed given 2 weeks notice to the central government to come out clearly on its issue of asking the private sector employers to compulsorily pay wages during the lockdown period.
Thanks, Anshul. We have a few more coming through the chat box. Let me just ask if anyone else wants to ask a question over the phone, *6, or through their video function. All right, then we can turn to the chat box, Anshul.
Sure. So I think One very interesting question, very relevant question from Sandeep here. And I think this question has been time and again raised, especially for those companies who do act as captive units or back offices for global organizations when they are rendering critical financial services or services in terms of customers for banking and insurance sector. Now, one thing is important here that when it comes to banking industry, telecom industry, we are talking about IT services which are providing support to the essential services sector like internet, etc. Uh, Authorities have taken a view that if you are only supporting the functions which are relevant to any industry which is operating outside the country, then in that case you may have to really apply for express permission, and you cannot consider yourself to be an essential services function who can avail the automatic exemption which has been granted from 20th April onward, being in the essential services category. So that is something you need to be mindful of. There could be companies which are having KPOs or business processing outsourcing services where they are taking calls from customers from abroad. Unless and until we are able to demonstrate that in some manner we are also dealing with customers of telecom companies or financial services companies or banking companies in India, that poses an issue, and you cannot assume that you will be allowed to function normally. So be mindful of that issue.
Okay. And I think we have still a few more in the chat box. We're getting up towards the end of our conversation, but I think we have time for one or two more. And for those of you, if we don't get to your question, I know Anshul will happy to be in touch. His email is up on the screen right now. We can also put you in touch if we're not able to get to it today, but just want to make sure that we will have plenty of time to follow up after on questions. So Anshul, in the chat box, there's a few more.
Sure. I think a couple of questions here. So it's about co-working spaces, and a very interesting question. We have WeWorks and the like, and we are talking about issues pertaining to those employers who may not have permanent spacing for their employees to function. Now, in that case, you really need to work in tandem with the building management, as I mentioned earlier. You need to ensure that if you have co-working spaces, authorities are really not going to take any exception to how you need to really follow in terms of SOPs, the guidelines which have been issued by the government. So be mindful, keep a track of what exactly has been told to you as a private sector employer to follow. So co-working spaces have to be managed in a particular manner where you need to move out, reach out to the concerned building management to ensure that you are doing your best in terms of fumigation or sanitation measures. And if there is any cost kind of factor which arises, then the underlying contractual stipulation may also be revisited in terms of what exactly would be cost escalation when it comes to cost sharing for sanitation and other measures to be taken to comply with the SOPs.
Great. And I think the last question you'll see there, and then we'll wrap this up.
Sure. Right. So, good question. And I think this is a scheme which has been floated. So, this is about establishment which employs minimum of 100 workers or more. No, so I would like to correct it. The government of India has floated a scheme which allows establishments having up to 100 employees at any point in time, and out of those 100 odd employees or less than that, at least or up to 90% of them have a monthly salary of Indian national rupees 15,000 or less. In those cases, the central government is going to take or bear the cost of social security contributions, which are ordinarily payable by the employer and the employee. So it is not about minimum 100 workers, it is up to 100 workers. And that is why it is more relevant for medium, small scale industries and not for larger players in the market.
All right. Well, thanks for that. I know there were some very specific company-specific questions, and I appreciate you giving them some guidance. Anshul, I want to thank you for spending some time very late now in the evening in India with us to go over, where companies are in terms of closures in the pandemic, and then as we look towards the next phase, how they'll best be able to protect themselves. I did mention that today's webinar is recorded, so we will share the link with everyone, excuse me, that shows, you can play it back anytime to allow others to see it. And lastly, I did want to restate that the Chamber has 4 task force that are looking at some of these issues. One looking at consumer-facing companies, one looking at industrial manufacturing and construction companies. The third is for office-based companies, and the fourth is for high customer density companies. And really, we're seeking to provide, for you to provide us feedback on sort of the policies that we need to put in place to ensure sustainable return to work, share best practices with each other so that we can all learn from each other in terms of what different organizations are doing, as well as identifying emerging issues that are coming out of developing these policies and return to work issues here in the U.S. So we're going to be starting that here in the U.S. and then copying some of those recommendations, which may change and evolve for situations specific to their employers in India. So again, want to thank you all for joining us with us. Anshul, thank you again for your leadership and presentation today. Have a very good rest of your day if you're with us in the United States, and good night to you if you're joining us from India. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Ami. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Good night.